So welcome to everybody to this public lecture as part of our class on science and cooking. I'm Dave Waits, and I want, before we start, to acknowledge the fact that to put this class together really took a huge amount of effort by a wonderful group of teaching fellows and assistants and a lot of effort, but it also took real contributions from sponsors who've helped us put everything together. Alicia is a group, or an organization in Barcelona that is associated with Ferran and many of the Catalanian chefs. Jose Andres Think Food Group also contributed. We put together a whole set of labs, and Whole Foods and Cole Palmer are donating the food and the supplies that allow us to do the labs. Harvard's Office of the Vice Provost and Faculty Development and Diversity has helped us put this as a Gen Ed course together. And then we've got sponsorship, all of whom have contributed to help make all of this possible. So I'm sort of just the warm-up act. You're supposed to be bored by me. But what I try to do is to... I said it, it's Dave. So you're bored. I'm Dave Waits. I'm a professor here. I'm one of the people who does the other side of the class, the science side. And so before we hear the lecture for tonight, what we want to do is try and give some sense of the science that we teach as well. So I'm going to tell you, my instructions from Michael were to review the whole class. We had an hour-and-a-half class to review the whole class in 10 minutes. I've probably used up 3 minutes of that, so I'm going to go pretty fast. I'm going to try and tell you what we're thinking about in terms of the science. This is the science not exclusively about tonight's lecture, but rather what we've been talking in the class so far. And this public lecture series will each time have a brief summary of the course to try and share with everybody really what we're doing, not just the wonderful lectures by the chefs, but also the science that we're trying to cover behind that. So last week we talked about food components, and each week we have sort of a summary of the whole week where we talk about what the theme of the week is. And the theme of this week is that the major food components are essentially polymers. They interact with each other, they interact with the environment, and they change their states. And that's what cooking is all about. And we tried to understand the molecular basis of the components of food, how we can gain energy, get energy from them, and what the connection between the phase changes that cooking can introduce and the molecular structure is. So we defined 4 different classes of molecules that make up food: water, fats essentially, sugars and carbohydrates, and proteins. And we looked at each of them. Water, of course, is a ubiquitous molecule. You can't live without water. In fact, you're made up primarily of water, and most of the foods that we eat, particularly before they're cooked, are made from water. And we describe some of the unique features of water. There's this unusual type of bond, this hydrogen bond that has an important effect on the behavior of water. Water is very polar, so you can put charge inside of water. And that means you can also change the pH of water. So water has a lot of very important properties, very unique properties. But you might ask, can we live on water alone? And we certainly need water to live on, but it's not enough to live on. We need all of the other molecules because that's where we get our energy from. And you can see that by looking at the ingredients on any label. Here's just a label of milk. And there's fats, proteins, and carbohydrates. And it's from these other molecules that we get the energy that allow us to live. And this energy is released when the molecules that make up these different food components are broken down. And we defined what the way the molecules are broken down by defining how we take the energy from the molecules, how we measure that energy. We measure it in terms of calories, and the calorie is the energy it takes to heat a liter of water by 1 degree C. And we actually demonstrated, by showing that you can get energy from one of my favorite foods. If you look at me, you can see that. It's a potato chip. And we took a potato chip and we burned the potato chip to gain the energy, and we showed that it would heat up some water that was in a Coke can, and it actually heated it up by several degrees. We just measured it. So we saw we got energy by burning things, and that, of course, allowed us to define what this equation of the week is, which is how much energy we can get from food, really in terms of the energy. And whenever we introduce an equation of the week, everybody claps. So we clap. You're now sharing in the real traditions that we're establishing in this class. We clap. Now this is actually important, both for the class and for tonight's lecture. What we've established in our class is that we clap on 2 specific equations. 1, when we see the equation of the week, we are, after all, a science class. And 2, when we see a beautiful dessert presented, because we like dessert. And so remember that for tonight's lecture. Then we talked about fats. We looked at various fats. We showed that this group of fat, in fact, this one, cocoa butter, is one that I hope we will learn more about tonight. But what we did was we looked at the temperature at which they melted. We saw that they all melt at different temperatures. Shortening melts at a much higher temperature. Olive oil at room temperature is a liquid. The others melt at different temperatures. And fats this is where they melt. They have also very high boiling points. That's important. That's why you cook with them. You can heat things up much hotter than water, and so that you can cook things at a higher temperature using fat. We all know that. But also, fats are very good for flavor and texture. You certainly enjoy eating fats. Then we looked at sugars, and we noted that sugars, in fact, come in various forms, but basically, like many molecules of food, they grow into large molecules. They form polymers, and this is, in fact, a different way of making polymers of sugar. And we took a particular sugar, sucrose, and we looked at the energy content of sucrose by actually looking at the bonds and calculating the amount of energy in the bonds to get some idea of what the total available energy in principle would be. In fact, it's a much more complex situation, because food is not burned the way I burn a potato chip, but rather is digested with various kinds of metabolic enzymatic processes to change it from its structure into ultimately carbon dioxide and water. We looked at amino acids. Amino acids or proteins are just chains, again, polymers of amino acids, and their structure can be changed both by temperature and by acidity and salt. And we actually used the fact that we can change it by acidity, not by temperature, to cook fish. Here are some examples of the wonderful teaching fellows preparing the experiments in the lab and cooking sushi-grade salmon so you can eat it using not temperature, but by changing the pH. And that leads to the recipe of the week, which is ceviche. And I have, one last thing. We talked about the 4-4-9 rule, the wonderful rule of thumb that proteins, carbohydrates, and fat have this amount of calories per gram, 4, 4, 9 on average. And we looked at Michael's favorite food, Toll House cookies, and calculated the caloric content and showed that it did follow the 4-4-9 rule. So I've used 10 minutes, that's the end, and I summarized the whole class in 10 minutes. I apologize if I went a little fast, but I hope you get some sense and some flavor of what we're talking about. And now, really, it gives me great pleasure to introduce the main act, the main speaker of the evening, Bill Yosses, and I'll let him actually tell you more about, you'll do that, right? You'll tell us, he'll tell you more about it. I think you've read about it, and I'll just sit down and be quiet and let him take over. Bill.
Thank you all for coming, and thank you for the great introduction on the science part. My name is Bill Yosses. I'm the executive pastry chef at the White House, and I have sometimes occasion to use some of the sort of scientific recipes that we're going to be discovering tonight, and it's a very sort of structured environment where I work. There are certain parameters for everything that we do. And normally there's a specific reason why we would make a certain dish, mostly generated around the guests themselves, where they come from, what the purpose of their visit is for. And, but there are times when we're not so conscribed and we can do pretty much whatever we want. We had an event a few months ago for the Cooper Hewitt Museum of Design. And there they just sort of let us go fly. And so we could do spherification and liquid nitrogen and all kinds of fun things like that. But one of the things I'm going to delve into tonight is that how really the science and cooking are so uniquely joined and have been from the time that the first caveman put meat over a bonfire. And it's just now, the exciting thing about a course like this is that we're beginning to look at it seriously and from a scientific and from a social point of view with groups like Alicia and with many of the chefs who are exploring this avenue of discovery. And what an exciting time to be involved in food in our country and the world in general. And much kudos to Ferran Adria, who is kind of a pioneer in this and who has just kept growing and growing and created this just firestorm of interest, controversy, dynamism, and plenty of criticism too. And all of that has just focused a lot of attention, and it's one of the reasons that we have a full auditorium tonight. And it makes me so happy that food has moved into become like a center of study in our culture, in the modern culture. Nothing could be more important in my mind. It's just totally, I cannot understand the way we look at food now, why it didn't happen sooner. Why were there not universities and food studies earlier? But it seems to be that it was just taken for granted. Food was just something we had at home and didn't deserve scrutiny, didn't deserve a kind of scientific investigation. It was something that at the same time was sort of too, what's the word I can use, too sacred to go into. And the combination of religion and food is a very common one. Food is used as a sort of totem or as a symbol in a lot of religions. You have, the Eucharist in the Catholic religion, or you have food taboos in all the religions, what you can and cannot eat at certain times of the year. So food seemed to be put into a category that was either not discussed at all or only discussed in very hushed terms that those rules could not be broken. And the great thing about Chef Adria is that all the rules are broken. And more than that, what's more important than just simply breaking the rules is why he did. When I was first started to be a chef many years ago, I would get curious, as everybody who begins in the kitchen does, and we would say, well, okay, that's the recipe, and to make a meringue, you add some lemon juice to the egg whites. Well, why do you do that, chef? You just do. That was the answer. Just do it. That's the way you're supposed to do it. That's the way we've always done it. So it's really huge for my profession to enter this sort of era where it's important to answer that question. Why do those egg whites react better when there's an acid added to them? And this was unheard of 30 years ago. So that's very exciting. Part of just the fact of this pure discovery and pure knowledge for its own sake makes my profession a lot more interesting. On a larger scale, from the point of view of public health, it makes it much easier for all of us chefs to talk to the general public or to our customers, which is usually how we talk to the general public, about what we are doing and what is quality food, why should we eat better food, why should we avoid processed foods? Why are they damaging? And why in our country do we have a diabetes rate that is just off the charts? Why is obesity such a huge problem in our country? The great thing about this course and many other courses like it is we can take those conversations out of the political realm, out of these realms where they're charged with emotion and accusations and all kinds of hoopla, and we can put it in a scientific context. Everyone is interested then. It doesn't have those. It doesn't have that charge. It doesn't have that negativity around it that all these questions can have when they're just discussed in a political sense. So that's the other reason I'm really happy about this course. So thanks to Harvard. Thank you particularly to already mentioned the physics department and the great TFs who have all been very helpful. Naveen in particular has taken me around and done everything that could be needed to prepare this course, and so my sincere gratitude to all of you for that. We talked about food studies. This is one of the sort of newest and most exciting, I think, because it's really based on just science and cooking. There are a few other fledgling areas in the world where food is being discussed in a sort of academic way. Marion Nestle at NYU has a wonderful food science program. It goes into the science as well as to the sociology, the anthropology, all different parts of how food and society interact. And that is very useful, as I say, from a public health standpoint, from a science standpoint, and from a chef's standpoint. To be able to understand how these things work is very crucial to how I do my job. There's also a great university, I'll just give them a shout out to, the University of Gastronomic Science in Italy. It's in Bra, B-R-A, a city in the northwest region of Piedmont, and it was started by Carlo Petrini, who is the founder of the slow food movement, another movement where, as opposed to fast food, he is concentrating on quality, on the best way to eat in terms of health, and also in terms of flavor, which are intricately related, most probably because of our evolutionary past. The thing that tastes good, are usually good for you. All of us developed a palate and an olfaction system, smelling, that told us, well, this is good to eat, this is not so good to eat. So the things that were good to eat, for example, in moderation, were sweet things. It's in fact the only innate taste that we are predisposed to like from birth is sweet. That is all the other flavors, bitter, sour, acidic, are then categorized culturally as we grow, as we develop, as we eat at home, and as we feed ourselves and look for new things to eat. We develop those sort of cultural biases. Bias in the sense of preference. Why do we have taste at all? Well, one of the reasons is, as again, if evolutionary biologists will tell us, that in order to avoid poisons and in order to find nutrition, taste and olfaction were central to that. So we were going out, if we ate something bitter, alkalis are bitter, and alkalis are primarily what poisons are made of. So tasting something bitter was an indication to our species and species before us that this was probably to be avoided. But all those things in our modern age can be tempered and can be combined to making a flavor profile that's very satisfying. There are some bitter flavors that we like. There's coffee and tea when they can be very flavorful in the right amounts. So what I'd like to also talk about tonight and relate what we're doing is to our tradition in America of food, which in the last 60 years has really been turned on its head by processed food, by what I would consider like a puritanical approach to food. That, well, why do we eat? Well, there's not this sense of celebration that you would find in Europe around food. That it's in the European culture, you look forward to the meal. It's a great part of the day, and everyone from the most you know, the man on the street, the person who is not involved professionally, you can have a long conversation in Italy with anyone about what's the best flour to use for pasta. In France, you can have an argument about eclairs and pâte à choux and what's the best way to make that dessert. Because it's a food culture, it's surrounded by all the people who are part of it. And one of the reasons for that is that they are also at the core an agricultural society. There's still a connection between farm to table. That's the kind of thing which hopefully a course like this would regenerate in our country, where we have people who are interested in where those ingredients come from. And it's really the source of where I began to be interested in becoming a chef. I was in France doing academic studies. I was a French major. But finding those kind of ingredients that you find nowhere else, or at least I hadn't found here in this country, a white peach, like a perfectly ripe, tree-ripened white peach, you can buy that anywhere in season in a good market in France. So that was the kind of thing that made me think about what do we cook with and what are ingredients and what is the purpose of eating. One of the great places to go, and I recommend it to you if you find yourself with a few hours free in Paris, is outside of Paris. There's a terrific market called Rungis, and it's a professional market, wholesale, so you can't buy things there, but you can go and look. And it's the size of Orly Airport, and in fact, it's built like Orly Airport because there's a number of airplane hangars spread out all over several acres, and in each airplane hangar there's a specialty. So as I say, you can take a cab there and go into these different hangars and see the most amazing food that's grown on the planet. It is, by the way, you should also book a cab to come back because there's no cabs out there. So don't just take the cab and hope you'll get back, because the truck drivers are not that nice, really. That's kind of also a universal about markets around the world. But it's fascinating. So you can go there, and there's one pavilion that is just for organ meats. There's one for vegetables, one for fruits, one for cheese, a huge one in France, of course, for all the greatest unpasteurized cheeses. So that is the kind of thing which inspired me to get involved in food, was seeing those ingredients in their best, at their best, in the very greatest ingredients. And as I say, that's because the European culture is related to the land, and the farmers feel that the more they put into what they produce, the better they're going to sell their product for, because there's not price controls like we have here. In America, we have price controls, we have federal marketing guidelines where if you grow a better almond, you cannot sell it, even though you spent more to grow it, you cannot necessarily sell it at a higher price, because the almond price is sort of fixed by the commodities market and by federal marketing guidelines. So these are the kind of things which hopefully will be changing. I'm so really thrilled and excited to be working in this administration where Mrs. Obama has set better food, quality food, and better diet for not only for young people, not only for kids, but for all of us. So that's also a very important component in what we're doing here tonight, and putting this subject up there on a pedestal and seeing how we can wrestle with it and how we can get to a place where we're all eating better. And who doesn't want that? I'll just finish that little sort of soapbox about better eating with by relating it to a person who I look to as really the founder of great food in America, and that was Thomas Jefferson. Not only did he have time to write Declaration of Independence and contribute to religious freedom in America, but he was a gardener, and a very good one. So he was the president for 8 years, but he was the gardener for the rest of his life until he was 83 at Monticello. That garden still exists, and I strongly recommend that you go to visit it if you are down there in Virginia. It is an amazing space. It's 1,000 feet of garden. It's managed by a man named Peter Hatch, who has been there for 35 years, and he has, as have people before him, been cultivating the same seeds and the same plants that Thomas Jefferson began with, and after his presidency ended in the early 19th century. Here's Thomas Jefferson. I have often thought that if heaven had given me choice of my position and calling, it should have been on a rich spot of earth, well watered, and near a good market for the productions of the garden. No occupation is so delightful to me as the culture of the earth, and no culture comparable to that of the garden. Such a variety of subjects, someone always coming to perfection, the failure of one thing repaired by the success of another, and instead of one harvest, a continued one throughout the year. Under a total want of demand, except for our family table, I am still devoted to the garden, but though an old man, I am but a young gardener. Thomas Jefferson, 1811, in a letter to Charles Willson Peale, a famous portrait artist of the time. And he shared with Charles Peale a fascination for all things natural, and also Peale created a museum at the time in Philadelphia in which they were studying, they were sort of some of the first archaeologists. Remember that around this time, Lewis and Clark had gone out to the West, and they were finding things like dinosaur skulls. And he was sending them back to Thomas Jefferson in the White House, who kept the collection, as did Peale. And so these were some of the first things found in Wyoming they were just astounded by these things. And they really thought those creatures still existed. Some people did. They thought that these were just recently dead animals that had been discovered. So fascinating man, of course, and really someone who realized that food was such an intrinsic part of our country and such a basic necessity. When we think about those people, why did they start the American Revolution? Well, they were idealists. They read the Lumieres in France. They read all the philosophy of the time. But they also were people who were farmers. And George Washington, he wanted a better price for what he was growing. He wanted better, and lower tariffs, of course, from Britain. So it wasn't only these ideals that sort of that led them to so strongly propose an independent country, but it was also food. So let me back up a little bit because I have some interesting. Let's see if that's the first one. Okay, we'll start there. This would have been the view from Thomas Jefferson's office. The room is not exactly the same now as it was then, but this is the Red Room in the White House. And let me go to the next one. This was actually where his office was, where you see the carpeting there. Of course, the White House was a brand new institution, and it had John Adams was the first inhabitant, so Thomas Jefferson was only the second tenant in the White House. And he decided to change things around. For one thing, this is a southern exposure on the White House. You can see this. Let me try one of these. I love these things. Wow, fantastic. I want to be a professor. So this is a southern exposure. He loved the southern exposure, and Jefferson had a long table made. It went from here all the way to here, and it went the whole length of this room. This is the state dining room now, and it looks down all those rooms that go all the way to the east wing of the White House. But in this table that he had here, he had, it was about 25 feet long, and he had little drawers all along it on both sides. So his day would be spent in these drawers, and he had, so he had like archaeology here. He had seeds and gardening here. He had, the meaning of democracy here. And these were the kind of people that they were. They were Renaissance men, and they just, because it was a young country and they weren't experts always available to them, they had to become experts themselves. So I think that's a fascinating view of really, that's today what it looks like. Every president since John Adams has walked those halls. And I think it's comforting for us to know that someone like Thomas Jefferson started in that room still exists, and his ideals still exist. And I think what we're doing tonight is fully in that tradition. So bravo to us. So let me see where else where we went before was a closer look at that red room, which is really just a beautiful picture to keep you all on the edge of your seats. That room has always been red. It happens to be Empire furniture now, which is late 19th century, and the decoration is due to Jackie Onassis, who restored the White House to a certain kind of level of historical accuracy. So we'll go to that, Thomas Jefferson. Good. Now we're on to the next part of the lecture. Why do we have certain predilections, and how did we develop taste, and more importantly, olfaction, or the sense of smell? So all mammals started out with a sense of smell, and in the beginning, the very beginning of life on Earth, they believed that there was already a sense of smell and olfaction, and even some very old creatures like sharks still have the kind of sense of smell that those early creatures had. Sharks smell through their skin. So they're able to absorb molecules in the water through their skin and know what something tastes like before they eat it. I always say sort of like a restaurant critic. So they were absorbing these molecules, they were tasting them, but as we developed in the evolutionary arc, then we became Homo sapiens, but we kept something very, very primitive. And in our makeup today, one of the reasons taste and smell are so integral to what we do is because here in the nasal septum you have all of the neurons which sense smell, and the olfactory bulb. But you notice this line here, that's the most interesting one. It's the only sense that connects directly to this almond-shaped here, which is the amygdala. The amygdala is the seat of emotions, of fight or flight, of our most primitive brain. And odd that one sense is directly connected to it. So one of the reasons we talk about that and how powerful the sense of smell is, although it's attenuated in humans, of course, is that it has always been part of art as well. So this fellow, although he had that's kind of a weird drawing of him. Can you see who it is? Yes. Marcel Proust had sort of a very intuitive sense of what we just saw here, and how, because these sensations were so strong, they didn't know about all this at that time, but that they were related to the connection to the amygdala. So now I have a question for you. Who got a little cup of something to eat when you came in? Who still has something in that cup? 3, 4, okay. That's all you're getting, so. No, but what's great is that now we can talk about memory. So those of you who didn't eat it, who followed the instructions, I'd like you to sort of look at oh, really? That's okay. That's all right. Because both ways work. If you did eat it, now I can go back to memory. And one of the points of what I was talking about is food and taste have a very strong connection to memory. So some of you may have seen something that you remembered, such as the mouse. Larry Burdick, who I also have to thank for his help on this course, makes these famous chocolate mice. And so maybe you remembered that, and you saw that and tasted that, and that brought back a memory of that sense memory. There was also a little bean in there that probably didn't taste very good. Who knows what that was? Yes, it was a cocoa bean, or sometimes we often use the Spanish term for it, cacao, because that's where most of it grows in Spanish-speaking countries. And when we say cocoa, a lot of people think of cocoa powder. So we sometimes use the other pronunciation, or cacao. So that's also a very important thing, and I'm sure you'll remember that because it didn't taste very good. But we'll get to that in a moment. In any case, to leave olfaction for a moment, one of the reasons I wanted to start this lecture out on that subject was that in 2004, 2005, I believe, Linda Buck and Richard Axel received the Nobel Prize for their studies of olfaction. And what they did was decode the genome that shows that there are over 400 gene receptors related to olfaction. eyesight only has a few, like the primary colors, whatever one considers the primary colors now, which is in debate. But, and with just a few gene receptors for vision, we can see millions of colors. So with 400 gene receptors in the olfactory bulb, imagine how many aromas and smells you can retain, how you can discern and maintain, and retain, I mean, as memory. So why talk about all this biology? Why would I discuss this in a course that's nominally about physics? Well, think of how, okay, we have this olfactory system, and it's really weak in humans. Dogs have a much stronger ability to smell. They can smell miles away. A polar bear can smell a seal at whatever, 10 miles away. So, and one of the reasons people think that, people who study it, evolutionary biologists, think that was because, for two reasons. One is we developed this trichromatic vision, meaning that there's 3 rods, you can see 3 colors, whereas most mammals, those mammals that are previous to howler monkeys and other primates, probably only have a kind of a black, white, and gray vision. We have color vision. So we can see that a berry that's red, that helps us identify it, that helps us categorize it as, oh yeah, that I should eat because it's that color. Why a fruit that's ripe has a different color than a fruit that's not ripe. So maybe this trichromatic vision made olfaction less important, whereas an animal could tell that by smelling it. The other reason, and this seems more apocryphal to me than anything, but when we started to stand upright, we no longer had our nose in the dirt. And the molecules that have aroma are heavier and generally fall to the ground. So you see a bloodhound dog following the trail of his quarry along the ground. His nose is right to the ground. That's where the molecules are. So as we stood up, it's conjectured that perhaps we didn't need olfaction as much, or that we weren't, it wasn't as effective anymore. But it's still pretty good, as we're going to discover in a minute when we start to heat up chocolate around here. So, so a lot of talk about biology, and we're going to get into the physics, I promise you, to the physics department before long. Okay. We're going to get into, okay, let's go back to that little cup. One of the things, as I said, that got me very excited about cooking was ingredients. At those markets in Rangis, I saw these fruits that look like jewels, and they're perfectly set in a case, and I began to think about ingredients, and that's really kind of the basic reason that I became a chef, and that a lot of people became chefs, is that very connection with ingredients and how we experience them. One of the things we talked about in the course is that, okay, if we have, we already know that we have attenuated olfaction. Our vision is probably not that great compared to a bird or an eagle. Our sense of hearing is not very acute compared to other mammals. And that got me thinking, well, what about all those senses that we don't have? There are some animals like zebrafish who have a kind of X-ray vision. Manta rays have a sense where they can detect an electrical charge. They can detect an electrical field. So if you ever go to one of those like aquariums or go to Hawaii and you're swimming with manta rays, you cannot touch them. It's impossible, even though they're very slow moving. As soon as their wing gets close to you in the water, they immediately pull back. They have the sense of electromagnetism. They have a sense that detects it. So it made me start to think, well, you know, if we don't have these, and some animals do, what else are we missing? What are mammals in general missing? And I think that was how sort of physics was created, because what kind of vision do we need to explore the world? And I think physicists sort of imagined that, well, we don't have enough, so let's make electron microscopes. Let's make, something to see. Let's judge what the distance of a light wave is, and try to discern from that how we can interact with the world. So that's my segue into physics, and I think it's sort of the basic just curiosity that we were born with that has led us to be able to make such wonderful discoveries. This morning, I spent the morning traveling around the different chemistry and physics departments, and wow, you guys are in the right place. This is really amazing, amazing place, and I can't wait to see what happens in the next, I'll be around for 20 or 30, I hope. So we'll see what happens. Let's make something. One of the great things about a course like this, as I said earlier, is that we have, when I was coming into the field, I was just told, okay, you make that recipe, that's it, don't ask questions. Now we ask questions. So typically a chocolate mousse, back in the day, would be made with melted chocolate. You might melt it with butter or something else to thin it out, because as we know, chocolate seizes when you add water to it, doesn't it? Sometimes. We're going to find out that not always. So what was happening with that chocolate mousse? Well, we put egg yolks into the chocolate, and we put whipped cream into the chocolate. And in my paltry understanding, what was happening was an emulsion was created. And it was the casein of those dairy products which was allowing the emulsion to happen. In other words, it was binding water and oil, what Dave talked about earlier. So the cocoa butter is a kind of oil, and the cocoa mass is a kind of liquid. So how were those things combining? Well, they were doing so with the casein from the milk. Okay, so here we're going to break all the rules, and we're going to make a mousse out of water and chocolate. But since we're not going to use the protein that is in the egg yolk and in the heavy cream, we're going to replace it with a different kind of protein. And this is an experiment that is suggested in a wonderful book called Molecular Gastronomy by Hervé Tisse, a Frenchman who has just a terrific repertoire, and who really, his love of food really comes through his writing. I mean, he always ends every chapter, but of course you'd have to make it taste good, which I really love that. So, and as he says, in this recipe, he says, well, you would take a hot liquid and you would add gelatin to it, and but of course you'd have to make the water taste good. So we're going to be a little bit more rigidly scientific here, and we're just using plain water. I think he recommends adding like creme de cassis or something. Very French. So, okay, we're adding gelatin. This is the kind of gelatin that we use if it's unfamiliar to you. It's a sheet gelatin. It's bloomed by adding it into cold water, and it comes in various strengths. This is the gold strength, which is the strongest one. So we'll melt it in the water so it disappears into that. And we'll add it to our chocolate mixture here. So it's just water and chocolate with a protein added, but a different protein than traditionally would be added. And we'll let it melt the chocolate. So theoretically, what's happening is that the oil and fat are separating now. So we've really sort of denatured the chocolate. We've separated it into its two parts. Who tasted that horrible cocoa bean? Good. Did anybody enjoy it? Oh. We have a strange group here. I love this. Wow, really? I like it too. But I think I like it as much for the intellectual part of it as I do. Okay, Marcel, we're done with you. Who knows what that is? That's the cocoa pod. That's what it grows like. And as you can see, it's coming from the actual trunk of the tree. It's not very far back, but it grows out of the trunk of the tree. It's incredible. Another pretty much what we might call prehistoric plant on our planet. It's a very peculiar plant. The pod grows out of the tree. It's a bearing fruit that the seeds are what we eat. So there's I don't know if you can see that very well. It looks a little dark on the bottom, but that's one of those pods cut open. And that sort of mucilaneous, so white covering there is really what the fruit is, and it's very sweet. But there's very little of it. It's just a very thin coating on these huge pockets of cacao bean that you tasted earlier. Those were particularly good cacao beans because they were criollo, which is the considered the best of the cacao beans. Criollo is the fattest and the biggest. Most cacao beans would be smaller, especially they've gone through a certain process before they got to you today. But they start out like that. And what happens? Okay, first of all, we start out with this thin covering of this sweet, fruity white covering and the beans inside. If you were to eat the bean at that point, it tastes very bitter and very starchy. It doesn't have really any gastronomic reason for living. But the Mayans and the Aztec people discovered a long time ago that if you poured all those into a big vat, as they did, just the rattan basket, which is still used today in many parts of South America and Latin America, they ferment. And as they ferment, because there's sugars there, they begin to change the composition of the cacao bean. And they begin to a little bit more taste like chocolate. After between 3 days and 2 weeks of fermentation, they're taken out and they're dried in the sun. And then they're delivered to Harvard for lectures like this. A very small part of them is. In fact, they're really hard to get because as a commodity, it's all sort of, it's packaged and sold in great, great quantities, and just like coffee and petroleum and things like that. So, and it's one of the, top 10 commodities in the world. But at that, what you tasted there is what it looks like when it goes to the manufacturer, which historically was always in Europe, primarily Belgium and Switzerland. Okay, that bean was taken and it was roasted a little bit farther than what you had. And by roasting, so you have the combination of fermentation, roasting, and a third process known as conching. So that could be a subject for the physics lab that we'll get into at another time. But conching means that that bean is crushed, and what's inside it? There are two things, cocoa butter and cocoa mass, as we said. And so you were tasting them in their natural state without any sugar. So got to add sugar to make it palatable, although the Mayans and the Aztecs didn't. They liked it just as it was. They preferred their cacao to be crushed, and they would just add a little bit of hot spices and a touch of human blood. So that was usually from their sacrificial victims, which somehow, that chocolate became really a religious, going back to religious connotations to food. That was an early one. So a little human blood and a little spices, and the Aztecs and Mayans were happy with their hot chocolate. I hear it's going to be at Larry Burdick's next week, so everyone can go. So in any case, to get back to the science part of it, the reason I started talking about all that is you have that fat and that liquid separated, which we just did here by adding hot water onto the chocolate, which is already conveniently chopped up to us. But we hope to create a very different kind of, it's all melted now. We hope to create a very different kind of mousse by putting it on ice and mixing it with this burr blender. This is maybe a little bit, I'll tell you what, it's a little bit too wide. I need to get it immersed, so let's put it in this. It's a little steeper. So, and what's going to happen is, if Hervétis and nature is right, what's going to happen is, as the chocolate cools, it's going to still form the emulsion, and the protein is going to facilitate that emulsion, the protein in the gelatin, facilitate that emulsion, and allow that fat to be redistributed in the liquid, in this case, water. Not only redistributed, but maintained in suspension. Okay, so let's, and I don't know if it, are you able to see this in any way? Here, I know it's pretty far down, but okay, as it cools and the air is going, you can see the bubbles already, so we have some success there. It's going to take a while in the ice here, but we're going to, you'll also notice that the color is changing. It turns into kind of a blondish chestnut color. I guess we can turn you off now. It turns into a kind of a blondish chestnut color. Yeah, it's okay. It'll go down so long as it's off. And you can see it starting to thicken there. Yeah, that's right. Keep it. Whoops. Oh, an immersion blender. You have like evaporators and you have distillers, but you don't have you have like laser, but you don't have. I see. Okay, you were just transmitting the question. I see. Okay. Talk about tool envy. I mean, I really had. Okay, so it's going to continue to set, but you can see that the color has changed to that light chestnut color. And I don't know if you can really, maybe if you can glimpse it as I do that it's starting to, yeah. You can see the trails that are left in the chocolate by the immersion blender. So what that means is that it's thick enough, even though it's only been melted like 5 minutes ago, it's thick enough to really swirl as a unit. Okay, is that visible? So and it's so as it sets, it becomes fully set like a chocolate mousse, and it remains that way. We did one 2 days ago, 48 hours ago. It's still set, still looks the same, and it has a very unctuous taste, or rather texture, very smooth, indicating that the emulsion is still there. And you can even see like this. It's a very shiny surface. That's another indication of the emulsion. Just as when you were eating those mice, you noticed that there was. I love saying that, eating those mice. So you noticed that there was a well-tempered chocolate, especially if you had the little squares, if you had that. A well-tempered chocolate has a very shiny surface. So let me see if I have, okay, thus. So, and why? That's something that also you'll delve into in the lab. But because those molecules are aligning in a certain way, and the emulsion, because even the raw chocolate or the couverture chocolate is an emulsion, it's cocoa butter and the cocoa mass. Because they've aligned in a certain way, they're all facing the molecules are all facing the same way, and so they reflect light. If you were not to have a smooth emulsion, or you were not to have well-tempered chocolate, which is done by going through different gradations of temperature and then re-raising the temperature, one of the methods anyway, you would not have that much reflection. Okay, it would just be dull. It would also, what happens is that the cocoa butter migrates to the outside, just as the oil comes to the top of water. The cocoa butter migrates to the outside, and your bonbons would have like white spots on them after a few days. But as it is, if you correctly temper, it stays in that state for a very long time, indefinitely. I shouldn't tell you this, but professional chocolate makers put them in the freezer, and 6 months later, they're fine. Even some of the best. But that's because it has maintained like because that emulsion is solid and those bonds are solid. So that'll be something that the science guys can tell you more about when they get to it. Okay. Anything more about chocolate? How'd they taste? Good, huh? Yeah, let's not forget that. That's the whole point of doing what I do. And it's also, by the way, something that I should emphasize, that anyone that I've met who does this kind of cooking, or the kind of cooking that Ferran Adria does, or Wiley Dufresne, and Grant Schatz that you'll meet in a few weeks, the flavors are impeccable. In those practitioners, those really, I'll say the best practitioners of this kind of cooking, their primary aim is flavor, and it's not to impress or to make headlines or to give seminars. It really is, the flavor has to be true, the flavor has to be natural. And I think that's something that we as chefs have to hold ourselves to. There's no point in doing it if it's not really a gastronomic experience. Otherwise, it wouldn't have to be done with food, it could be done with anything. There's kind of another, we already talked about it, but we'll go to the next. So that's a very magnified photograph of an emulsion, and you can see that those the fat globules are suspended in a liquid. So that's what the mouse looked like inside, if you were. And it's what this looks like inside too. If you were to take a very magnified picture of that. Okay, we'll leave it here and let it set up a little bit longer. Great. Do you like it? Are you liking it? Are you enjoying the? Great. Okay. So that's our Chantilly chocolate. Okay, some more cooking. The other thing that also will come into play on the science part for this is crystallization, because what has happened is the chocolate, as the temperature dropped with the ice, it was crystallizing around the air bubbles. So that'll be another subject of discussion. Let's do some more cooking. Foams. Who remembers that little rubbery white thing in the paper cup? Yes. You know what it was, I hope. It was a very small piece of marshmallow. So that's another one of the subjects that we talk about in this course, foams, which can be many different things. In that case, it started out as a meringue, and we can make one now. So a meringue is simply the egg whites, which have been loosened a little bit with lime juice. By loosened, I mean it breaks down the albumin a little bit, and it enables the albumin to form around those egg whites and to maintain a bubble. So I learned more about bubbles this morning than I ever thought there was to learn, and mind-blowing. Is Cindy here? No, I guess she didn't make it. One of the chemistry students who creates the most amazing bubbles with this incredible machine that I wish I had. Besides, I'll trade my immersion blender any day. It was the most dense meringue imaginable. I mean, as a pastry chef, we're very, our whole life is about meringues and this machine, and the more you whip something, or for example, I said, we're going to put an acid inside, so we're going to put an acid inside this egg white here, and that's going to help us make a better meringue. Some people use cream of tartar, which has that's an acid that has the same effect, but there's even a better way, the old-fashioned way, which hardly anybody does anymore because it's too much work, and that is doing it by hand in a copper bowl. So the static electricity also contributes to how small the well, I may be getting into a questionable area there, but I know that the bubbles are smaller. You'll have to ask them why. Okay, so we begin to make the foam, and the tines of the whisk are breaking through. It also helps, and this is just purely a cooking lesson. To make a great meringue, which is very important, the bowl has to be clean. Absolutely no grease at all on the outside of the bowl. The egg whites should be room temperature. They should be left out for before you break them, or after you break them, doesn't matter. And also, old egg whites make a much better meringue. The problem is if you leave egg whites around for a long time, they could develop some contamination. So I would only recommend old egg whites if you're going to bake it thoroughly. So in other words, over like 180 degrees Fahrenheit in making a baked meringue, for example. Can you hear me with this racket here? Let me get away from it. So clean bowl, a little bit of acid, old egg whites, and we start out a little bit fast like we are right now, and just to get it started so the tines can catch into the meringue, into the egg white. And then the best meringues are done at a medium speed. You get a much better result. The bubbles are created in much smaller portions, so it's much more unctuous, much more satisfying as a texture when the bubbles are smaller. So what we're making here is marshmallows, which you had a little taste of. But an interesting thing about those marshmallows was that they were flavored. So that poses a real problem to pastry chefs, because we know that making a meringue like this, we can probably get 10 times the volume from that. That's only 4 egg whites. I can fill this bowl pretty much to the top if I let it go by whipping it. So we know that we can get a lot of volume, but what we don't know is how to keep it stable. So one thing that we do, sort of the modern pastry chef does, is put a small amount of xanthan gum in there. That helps to stabilize it. But it's very hard to add flavors to egg whites. So that's why you always see in the cooking shows, they'll make a meringue and then they'll fold something into it, which you lose a lot of volume doing that. So you could, for example, take raspberry puree and you would fold it into these egg whites carefully, not to break it down. But eventually it would break down because there's nothing really there for it to hold it together. So in baking and pastry, we might add gelatin. Or we might, in the case of baking, we might make a souffle. So old-fashioned souffle, we would add the egg yolks. Or we would cook the egg yolks with a starch, like arrowroot or cornstarch or flour, and make those join together with a little bit of milk. And with that, we would take the egg whites, the whipped egg whites, fold it into there, and bake it. So those starches would cook and hold it together for a while. Again, xanthan gum helps. But the heat expands the bubbles that are in these meringues, and as they expand, they make the souffle rise. But I learned this morning that it's not only the heat and the size of the bubbles expanding, it's also the moisture. So and in fact, probably much more effective than the expansion of the bubbles. It's the moisture that's evaporating, and as that evaporates, it pulls the souffle up. So I'll try and show you. I don't know how. So you can see we get a lot of volume with just 4 egg whites. And the sugar is helping it to bind together. So what did I do with, well, I'm not going to be able to heat it. But imagine I heated this gelatin. That's the recipe for a marshmallow. Actually, I think it'll go into it. the abrasion from the tines should warm it up. Okay, so now we have a foam, a marshmallow that you tasted. One of the other very classic recipes, I can turn that off, that gives you the idea. What you would do now is you would either, if we were doing it commercially, we would take that out, you'd spread it on like a cookie sheet and let it set even at room temperature. At that point, you cover it with a mixture of powdered sugar and cornstarch because it's very sticky. It stays sticky forever. And you cover it with that. You sift that over it so you can handle it, and then you might cut it with scissors. Or in the case of what we gave you today, a very French style of doing marshmallows, which they call guimauve, beautiful word. They extrude it out of like a pastry bag in strips, and then that's what you had. So all of these are very classic recipes, just looked at through the perspective of the science behind it. Here's probably one of the most simple recipes and a very old one. It is, all that's necessary is flour, bread flour, a very strong gluten flour, some kind of oil, in this case olive oil, salt, which helps to break down the bonds there, and water. And what this is a strudel recipe, strudel dough. So what we've done is we mixed it and we ran it in the machine for a long time, which helps those gluten strands to form. So the gluten that's forming is just barely inhibited by this oil, because when we really don't want the gluten to form, say when we're making I don't know, certain breads you want to be soft, or pie dough, for example. There's a perfect example. Pie dough, you want it to be crumbly and soft, and so you add fat, sometimes lard, or it could be butter to it. And what that lard or fat does is it coats those strands of gluten so they become very slippery, and they can't hold together and recombine and become more elastic. So elasticity will be a good subject, and I'm sure that will be delved into during the course. But so this recipe has only a little bit of oil, just enough to help it come together, and so that gluten can form this very elastic dough, basically. So my first job was in a pizza parlor, and we actually did that, yeah. So I know it's always kind of surprising, isn't it, that it's not just in the movies or something. Let me get that out of the way before I contaminate it. So strudel dough, it's an Austrian specialty, and it's a very peculiar recipe or technique. I've never seen it in anywhere else, but it's so unique and so wonderful that I thought I would do it with you. And it will, we can delve into the whole subject of elasticity and what happens to the gluten, also even what happens to the salt when it mixes with the flour. So what they do is they begin to stretch it, and if you're doing this, in the beginning you want to start out with, let it touch the table a little bit so you can get it started, because it's pretty easy to rip. But also this we made recently, so it's not quite as elastic as it could be. It's better to let it sit overnight, but I think you'll be able to get you'll get the gist of it. So, and you never use your fingertips because that will puncture the dough, but you use your knuckles like this. So as you stretch it out, and you let gravity do the work. Okay, so gravity's pulling that. And what we do in the don't worry, nobody's going to eat this. God knows what's on this table. With you guys. I don't trust you. Okay, so that's the idea, is that you know, and this is much better if the person doing it is about 360 pounds. Somehow, that's really what you know, Austrian cooking is about. It just looks better when you have like the Pillsbury Doughboy. But I'm getting close to that 360 pounds the longer I work in this field. So As I say, we're going to have to, this is only going to go so far. But I think you get the idea. Like if we had done this last night, we would easily be able to cover this table, this half of the table, with this. You see how much is left over here? This on the edge is still very thick. So you're able to get a huge amount. Now, what happens if go back to the cooking lesson part of this, if you're doing this, don't leave it for too long because it dries out very quickly. So you would have, if you were a classic Austrian chef, you would have clarified butter, so butter that's been melted and the milk solids removed. And you would start brushing it about this point as you pull it farther and farther. I want to get it at least to the edge of this table. Got to have some kind of accomplishment. And so this happens. You can kind of recombine it a little bit. Sometimes it works. Save that to the end when when you're putting your cinnamon apples and breadcrumbs and more clarified butter. Okay, so, I would love to put this in that electron microscope and see what this looks like. Chefs have all the same old tired sayings, You have to read a newspaper through it. Keep going until you can read the newspaper through it. Those are not chefs who do a lot of reading, I guarantee you. Okay. Well, anyway, I think you get the point. So, okay. So there you go. Yes. What beautiful dessert. Beautiful. Yeah. It's really not completed yet, but let's leave that there and see what happens to it. That'll be interesting. Okay. Onward and upward. You see how the chocolate has congealed on this? So it's shiny. There's no like gradations or different sort of, I don't know what you might call like dots. You see like these, if it's not really an emulsion, then it'll begin to have like little points of almost like tiny sand in it. So we can see how, and this too has set. It takes a bit of time for it to set. I'm told that when tempering chocolate, you can work with it right away, of course, but the actual, once you have that seed that starts the crystallization process in tempered chocolate, to be fully set, it takes 24 hours. So stuff is still going on. Here, this is a good example of the way it sets. So it's not liquid at all. Okay. So finally, one last demonstration that for a couple of purposes. One about flavor, and one about these techniques that are used now in a lot of kitchens, and sometimes it's just for pure convenience. Like it takes a pretty long time to make ice cream. By the time you mix it and put it in the Carpigiani or one of your ice cream machines or your gelato machine, and it will. It takes a long time for it then to set. You have to put it in the freezer until it really congeals and you can use it. So one of the ways to do it fast is to do it with liquid nitrogen. So can I have my assistant chef come to help me? So again, we have the, yes. Safety first. The other thing I want to bring up is that these are the kind of flavors that I find people are looking for today. So this is an olive oil ice cream or olive oil sorbet. A very rich olive oil, and it's good to cut it with a little bit of lemon or lime juice, in this case lime juice, and a water. It's the type of thing which is very refreshing, it's satisfying, but it doesn't have the fat or calories that those things we talked about before. Okay, so you whisk and I'll pour.
Got it.
Okay, a little more quickly there before it. Yeah, keep going. Is it very cold? Here, let me lift it up a second. He's from the insurance company. You want to switch places? You tired?
It's almost there. Almost.
Oh yeah, starting to get there, right?
Ah,
Is it too cold? Still soft.
yeah. You want to?
Yeah.
This is why you're the White House pastry chef.
Oh, yes. Expendable. Okay, so instant ice cream. Olive oil sorbet. Thank you. Thank you, Naveen. Beautiful. Maybe just an extra dose just for the fun of it. Thank you very much. Thanks. Thank you. Fantastic.
Thanks very much.
My pleasure. You
We
want
have
to
a
do?
lot to teach based on what you've shown.
Oh yeah. Well, I was told this is
You've
going to be
given us our
reviews.
challenges.
Yeah.
So we have some time for some questions. If
Sure.
People have questions. Do we have microphones, Naveen?
I think
Well,
so.
I'd like to, if you could you bring it back there? If you could speak into the microphone so that everybody can hear you and Naveen.
Foods like chocolate can be political. I'm wondering if in your role you have to do your research about the politics of the food ingredients
No.
that you use?
No, no.
And do our president and first lady have chocolate preferences?
Okay. Number one, that thinking is done for me. And the answer is given to me before I ever get. So it may have political connotations, and so whatever they are is decided above my head. They're not particularly fond of chocolate. However, the president does like salted caramel chocolate bonbons. That's a state secret, so it cannot leave this room.
Does somebody have a microscope? Yeah.
The president's family is as close as we have to royalty, and the White House is the castle. Are there things in sourcing the foods that you use in the White House that you have restrictions on sourcing it for keeping the food safe that's served in the White House?
Another good question about science, thank you. Yes, there's a lot of protocols in place to make sure that that the family is safe. That's all I'm going to say about it.
Well, thank you. That preempted half of my question. I was curious how you got the job at the White House. And I was going to ask, to the extent that you're at liberty to discuss it, I do know somebody who went through the whole, clearance process to cook for somebody, a president once, and to the extent that you were allowed to talk about the special security precautions that are necessary.
Very minimally, but my predecessor was there for 25 years, a man named Roland Mesnier, and a great figure, a great chef in general, and helped me a lot when I came there. He may have had part of the vote. I didn't know him well, but I think it's, first of all, they don't tell you. To answer your question directly, nobody tells you. I mean, they do have what's called a tasting, process where you go and you cook some samples of what you can do, and then you're judged on that. And so, yeah, that was one thing I did. And Roland really, really wanted to retire, so I think that that helped. One thing that was mentioned to me kind of offhand, which may have had something to do with it, I had done a little article for Food Arts magazine in which there was a photograph of a dessert with a kind of a pulled sugar piece that was like a palm tree. You saw an example, I think, of, oh no, it was somewhere else, but pulled sugar is a decoration that pastry chefs use where they heat sugar to a high temperature and then you can blow air into it or shape it into different shapes. It's like blowing glass. And so that piece was in Food Arts magazine, and I think the social secretary, who is one of the arbiters that who makes that decision, saw that and gave me a call. Yeah.
What's the most interesting dessert you've made for the president?
There's a disembodied voice where I'd like to see who's. Can you raise your hand, whoever said that? Yeah. Oh, very good. Okay, the most interesting dessert I ever made for the president. Like I was saying earlier, that sometimes we're asked to do a very traditional dessert, depending on the situation and who the guests are, which is we need to be adept in that. But I think maybe one of the most interesting ones was for the Cooper Hewitt Museum in New York, and they were giving out design awards. So I did a recipe that comes from Ferran Adria's book, in which he mixes hot sugar with olive oil, and then begins to pull it. And it was really more of a decoration than a dessert. But you pull this strand of hot sugar into a very fine thread, and then you wrap it around a rolling pin. So you get this thing that looks like a slinky. So, and it's very crunchy, of course, and breaks, but it's a very beautiful dessert, and it's quite unusual. So, and it tastes good because it just tastes like sugar and olive oil, my two favorite things in the world.
This is a science question.
Yes. Oh, okay. Guys, you're up.
You mentioned that it was difficult to add flavorings to marshmallows,
Yes.
but you didn't get into
You're right. I skipped
how
over
you
that.
did that.
Absolutely. Yes. Good. Thanks for bringing that up. We were really paying attention. Too close. If we add, whatever we add to this breaks it down. So it's not such a problem if we're making a mousse because everything else that we add into it, enough of those air bubbles will remain that the gelatin will hold it together and it will still stay light. But for marshmallow, all it is this meringue. So, and the gelatin will secure it in place. But if you add something like an oil to it, you'll really lose a lot of volume because the oil will then, you'll collapse all those bubbles. You just have to have something very concentrated. So what I use is from the fragrance industry. And there are very natural products that can be used for flavoring something like that, which only take just a minuscule amount of flavor. And they're natural, like natural rose essence. These are called essential oils. You have to be careful because not all essential oils can be used. Some of them have sort of ingredients that you don't want to consume. But there are many that are completely natural. And I can give you a good source. A woman in California named Mandy Aftel, A-F-T-E-L. And she's also written a book about perfume through the ages. And it began with the study of alchemy in the Middle Ages. And the people who were alchemists were also fragrance creators. And her book is fascinating. Her website is fantastic. Her website's called aftelier.com, aftelier.com, and she sells these. And if you go online and write to her and ask for specifically food-safe essential oils, you can do that. And you just need a minuscule amount because they're very powerful. But that's the type of thing that I would add, and that's the type of thing that was added to the marshmallow that you had. Oh, you have to really test it because they have different potencies. But what I would do is just like take the head of a pin and dip it in there and then start incorporating, little by little by just microscopic practically amounts until you get what you want. And also some of these things, some of those oils really kind of take on potency with time as they combine with the other ingredients. So it's kind of, learn as you go situation.
Can you use plant-based proteins in the emulsions that you talked about today rather than gelatin?
Yes, we could have used agar, made from seaweed. So you could, that was a question that came up earlier too. That's the type of thing that, that mousse could be a vegan dessert if you were to use agar.
Yes, there's two big movements within the food industry right now. There's the local, simple, basic foods, and then there's this entirely out of the laboratory scientific approach that you see in molecular gastronomy. Which side do you tend to enjoy cooking more, and which side do you think has the best flavors to it?
Oh, I think they're compatible. I don't think they're two sides. I think they're one side, and that's very interesting that you brought that up. Very good question. Because a lot of the people who are working with, scientific kind of help or just those kind of ideas are very involved with the sustainability, local, and later in this series you'll have Dan Barber, so someone who is really like the epitome of local sustainable, and he's certainly open to the molecular gastronomy things where appropriate. I mean, it's not, as we said before, most of this people who are doing this at a really quality level are very concerned about flavor. They're concerned about local, sustainable, and the quality of the ingredients that go into what they're making. So I don't think they're opposite sides. I think they're very compatible and should be.
She's asked something. Okay.
Have you ever tried to make a mousse au chocolat with only chocolate? Because there is protein in the chocolate that can...
Yes, we did. I didn't get into it because it's a whole, Naveen and I did do that yesterday or the day before. And it didn't fit at all into what I wanted to talk about, so I ignored it entirely, like a good scientist does. He was able to make a very substantial mousse, very light, with just water and chocolate. I mean, couverture, you can't just do it with that by introducing air, at least in any way I know. But Naveen was able to introduce enough air that it stayed very fluffy and light and lasted for several days. So that's something that needs to be explored.
Did he use the super mixers in his lab?
Yes, he must have used some kind of black magic.
Super tool.
Yes.
I was wondering, you used the gelatin in the mousse, or you could use the proteins in the chocolate. You used gelatin in the meringue.
Right.
And you used the gluten in the dough.
Right.
But you didn't use any protein in the sorbet. So I was wondering what you used to emulsify that.
Oh, I don't think it's really emulsified. I think it's, what happened is it's just frozen. So really you would have sort of a crystalline consistency that would be a little bit crunchy like a granita. So it's not that everything has to be emulsified in order to taste good. But yeah, as you can see here, it's already starting to melt and separate. But what I would do is I would keep it just like that. In fact, at El Bulli, there's a fantastic dish which is based on gazpacho, but the real Spanish gazpacho, which is garlic, olive oil, and bread, and no tomatoes. So what he makes is this, he blanches the garlic 4 times in water so that you eliminate all that really harsh flavor. And then he purees that with milk, I believe, maybe 8 noses with milk, and strains it. So that's on the outside of the, and olive oil, and that's on the outside of the plate. And then there's this kind of like tomato water, which basically what you do is you take tomatoes, mix salt, put it in the food processor, and let it drain, and a very clear water comes out, but it's incredibly powerful tasting. It tastes really like a tomato. So then he makes like a sorbet like this out of the tomato, but it's the same color, completely white. So it's a white gazpacho, but with the flavor, strong flavor of tomato and of the basically what's kind of an aioli or a gazpacho base, and it's out of this world.
Yeah, I was wondering if you have a new good way of making aioli with only garlic and oil.
Well, they're so basic. I mean, I would stick with that. I mean, that's the Farinadria aioli but definitely at least 4 times poaching those, or not poaching really, it's blanching the garlic in hot water and changing the water each time and shocking it in ice and then making a puree with that and thinning it with water. So it's very very soft garlic flavor, very natural, but none of that sort of sharp acidic flavor of raw garlic.
So at the risk of confusing the chefs and the scientists, we are going to show that in class in 2 weeks and in the public lecture in 3? 3 weeks. So if you're here, you will see the scientists' way of doing it. Any other questions?
We aim to please.
Yes.
I had
up there.
Okay.
I was wondering if you can comment on the controversies regarding high fructose corn syrup. I figure since you're a pastry chef that maybe this has something that you can talk about.
Oh yeah, we're supposed to call it high fructose sugar now or something. We're not supposed. Corn sugar, I'm sorry, yeah. As if that's going to change what it does. You know, there are farm subsidies to the tune of like $20 billion that supply 3 major crops, soybeans, corn, and wheat. And if you go into the processed foods section of your grocery store, which is pretty much the whole grocery store, you will see that those 3 products are in almost everything. So that's what, you know, has brought this whole crisis about, And the high fructose corn syrup certainly is one of those that lives on federal subsidies, which is in everything, which has contributed to our terrible state of health. And changing its name to corn sugar is not going to change anything.
So kind of along the same topic, you mentioned early in the lecture, the high incidence of diabetes and obesity, et cetera. Yet as a pastry chef, you have to cook with lard and sugar.
Oh, good point. I'm so glad you said that.
Are you finding that, especially in this administration, you're being asked to cook more nutritious desserts or pastries, or are you sort of, trying to experiment with creating more healthy desserts?
Great. Thank you for asking that question. Very important question. I'm just walking Schadenfreude, what I always say is, and I'll answer the second part of your question first. Yes, we do use a lot of methods for making desserts more healthy. We lower the sugar, we replace it with honey or other natural sugars, which is kind of a halfway measure because sucrose is sucrose. Although honey is more easily digested because it's not as complex a carbohydrate as refined sugar. We do use more natural whole grains in baking, and there are some, like God bless them, Conagra has come up with a kind of whole grain flour, which really does not have the bitterness that whole wheat flour used to have. They crush it so finely that you still have the bran and the germ, which is where the nutrients are, and yet the flour is just barely a little more yellow than bleached flour, and it doesn't have the bitterness that typically whole wheat flour has. So there's a lot of progress in that area. Of course, when you talk about pastry, people immediately assume that, well, that's something bad. It's no worse than the fats on pork belly or something like that. But I do say this: one of the things that we recommend is that is moderation, of course, and portion size is important. If you go to the coffee shop and there's like coconut cake that high, do you really need that much? And that's one thing that I touched on earlier when we talk about quality ingredients and the ingredients that are used in, they can be used sparingly because your body recognizes that nutrition as being a wholesome and full, as opposed to processed food where you can eat all you want and you're still not satisfied. So one of the areas of study now in food science as well as in public health is satiety and what makes you feel more full when you eat. So, and a lot of that is found to be things like legumes and whole grains, which take longer to break down and which stay with you longer as nutrition. So that's kind of a long-winded answer, but so moderation, portion size, and we don't eat dessert every day, and we use better ingredients when we do make the dessert so that a smaller portion is satisfying. I think that way desserts can be part of a healthy lifestyle, even if I don't want to say, well, desserts can be healthy in themselves, but they can be. And to me, it's so important that desserts remain part of the conversation and remain part of how we think about food, because they're essentially pure pleasure. We're not really eating desserts for nutrition. I mean, there's a little nutrition, but not much. And but what I wouldn't want to happen is that the food conversation all of a sudden be just about health, be just about what's good for you, because that feeds into a very old American tradition of Puritanism, of pleasure is evil, of our Calvinist background, where if you ever saw the movie Babette's Feast, a perfect example of people who could not enjoy food because there was so much other things attached to the food, like we started talking about. So I would always insist that pleasure and food and the enjoyment around the table be part of the conversation, because otherwise we lose too much of the reason that we eat.
One last question.
I was wondering, with all the food science becoming more and more popular, what about traditional and old technique? The approach of when you make a mousse, you do make a meringue and you make a custard, you cook some egg yolks and all that technique. Is that gonna affect the chefs of the future? And
Oh, good question. Good question. Well, I would hope it wouldn't be lost because everything is based on that anyway. And you can go to the most, far-fetched cuisine, and all of it is still revolves around those kind of principles that were pretty much developed. I mean, the first cookbook is considered to be the Le Viandier de Paris in 1600 sometimes, and then in the early 19th century, Carême is kind of the person who codified a lot of these recipes, or Escoffier after him. So all of these new techniques sort of spring from that tradition. And I think there will always be a place for that because they've been vetted for so long. And it's like some of the best recipes that you can ever find is home cooking recipes. They've been in a family for generations, or even if not for generations. But a family is the best way to find a good recipe because kids at the table don't lie. I hate that, Mom. Don't make it again, So those recipes, they've really, been through the test of time and some of the most difficult critics in the world, the under 12. So, yeah, I think there's always going to be that kind of satisfaction because part of the satisfaction of eating is that repeating what we learned at the table, with our parents.
How do desserts slow the passage of time?
We were going to get into, and I will enter that with, I'm going to be paraphrasing here so Albert Einstein doesn't roll over in his grave. But the reason I started out with that subject was that as we were talking about when you had those things to eat when you first came in, and then in order to talk about it, we had to talk about your memory. So that is a creation, that is a subjective time. You still maybe can go back in your memory like Marcel Proust did and access that memory, even though it happened 2 hours ago. So desserts, it was kind of what can I say, a sort of accordionized way of thinking about desserts in the past and thinking about, that's timeless. What is time? The physicists will tell us, well, it's the Earth's rotation and around the sun or something. What does that even mean? That's not time. And there's definitions of time that are like, well, time is what prevents everything from happening all at once. I mean, to me, that's about the only definition of time that really makes any sense. We're going to get in a fight match here.
No, with that definition of time, let's thank Bill again.
That's fantastic.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.